Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as a Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. I'm thrilled to see all of you here today for a conversation with the author Dylan Penningroth, and he's joined here with Professors Wallace Best and Dirk Hartog. This program will run for about an hour. There will be an opportunity for questions. We are grateful to our partners, Labyrinth Books, who are kindly here so you can buy copies of Before the Movement, The Hidden History of Black Civil Rights for $35. Please note that this room is T-Coil enabled, so if you have a T-Coil enabled device, you can put that on now. If you'd like to try the headsets, we have some on the piano there. We ask, so the system works, everyone needs to speak into a microphone, so during the Q&A, wait for me to bring you the microphone. It just makes it easier for everyone to hear. I want to thank Dozier Hammond for bringing this program to our attention, Denise Leslie and the Black Voices Book Group for selecting the book discussion this month. I should say that we are able to host the Black Voices Book Group specifically because Dylan's mother, Penelope Baskerville, approached the library in 2012 to see if we would be a home base for the book group that she was leading at the time. So it's particularly meaningful. Many thanks to Mrs. Joanne Parker and others in the community for helping to get the word out about today's program. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Dylan Penningroth, once of Princeton and now professor of law history at the University of California, Berkeley, a MacArthur Prize Fellow and author of The Claims of Kinfolk, African American Property and Community in the 19th Century South, as well as the book we're discussing today. He lives in Kensington, California. Penningroth is joined by two Princeton professors, both of whom have published numerous books and are highly esteemed. Wallace Best, who specializes in 19th and 20th century African American religious history, and Dirk Hartog, class of 1921, bicentennial professor in the history of American law and liberty, emeritus. Before the Movement has at least 3 awards to its name, and it is no wonder there are so many stunningly positive reviews for the book, including from our book group. It was hard to choose one, but I will go with Alexis Madrigal from KQED Forum. A brilliant reframing of African American history that centers the everyday lives of Black people. This book is on my short list for a Pulitzer. Please join me in welcoming Dylan and
Guess I'll go first.
Oh, is your thing on?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. It's allergy season, so my voice is responding accordingly. So I want to say first, congratulations, Dylan, on a simply spectacular book that is certain to change perspectives, not only on the civil rights movement, but also on social movements generally. I think you have captured something important about how true social change happens. So thank you for that. I was there for 2 of those awards you got already. More to come, that's what I said to him as he came back to his seat. So, and I'd also like to say welcome home to a place you know well, a place that has formed you and perhaps continues to form you in various ways. And that's where I'd like to begin with my questions for you today. You grew up in Princeton. These roads, this neighborhood, this building, and the one before it, many of the people gathered here today are known to you and you know them. So I just want to ask, to get you all emotional, what does it mean for you to be here in this place at this moment? Having written this book with the experiences of your time in Princeton very much in mind, so I want to invite you to connect Princeton to this book.
Thank you, Wallace. Before I say anything else, let me just say thank you to Kim Dorman for organizing this event. I want to say thank you to Wallace and Dirk for agreeing to be the conversation partners. I think Dozier Hammond might have been one of the people who thought up the idea in the first place, and I'm really grateful to him as well. And to the Black Voices Book Group for choosing this book to be here today, and to my mom for bringing all of this together. I'm so grateful to all of you for coming. This really means a lot to me to be here in this place at this time. I guess the short answer to your question is it's hard to put into words. I have a lot of memories, obviously, of growing up in this neighborhood. I grew up on Birch Avenue right over there, and on 166 Witherspoon, on Lytle Street, McLean Street, just all there. But 210 Birch Avenue, me and my sister Haley, we grew up there our whole lives. And so just being back in this place means so much to me. I should also mention, I think Wallace kind of alluded to it a little bit, that this spot, I'm not sure exactly where the children's section was, but I think pretty much every day I would come to this library, or the previous building, when I was a little kid, and I would come here every day, and I would walk in, and I would go to the children's section, and Mrs. Carlson would meet me somewhere near the entrance, and she would say, "I have a book for you." And she never had it in her hand. She would lead me, she would walk me down the aisle so that I could see all the other books along the way. And I would always pick up 3 or 4 more as we got to that one. And so that memory really is glowing brightly in my mind right now. So I feel kind of emotional as well as everything else.
Thank you, John. I knew there would be a connection you could make, and so it's wonderful to hear that. Well, I want to ask then, aspects of this book are personal and familial. It's about family as well. And I can name names, having read the book. Craig Baskerville, Thomas Holcomb, Jackson and Louisa Holcomb, Yolanda and Osborne Reeves, and of course, Penelope Penny Baskerville. So your family are central to the stories. So I want to know what convinced you as a historian that this approach or method was not only a good approach, but perhaps a necessary approach. As some people may know, historians are often trained to be objective and not subjective, even though Peter Novick in that wonderful book, That Noble Dream, tried to get us, he wrote back in the 80s sort of to dispel the myth that historians write in that objective way. We all write what we know from where we are to some degree, so we've accepted that. You have seemed to just embrace this personal and subjective aspect of much of what you've written in this account. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a really great thing to point out. And I think what I can say is that it comes from a place that is obviously very personal, but my ability to put the personal into what is, after all, a work of history, it owes so much to those who came before me. And I'm thinking of that in 2 senses. One is academic historians who have changed the way that our profession thinks about the relationship between what you might call family history and so-called academic history. And I'm thinking of a wonderful article by Kendra Field called The Privilege of Family History, in which she points out that white historians for generations have found it perfectly fine to put elements of their own past, their own families, into their narrative. So you think of U.B. Phillips, Life and Labor in the Old South. It's just a racist apologia for slavery. And he bases part of this on an assertion that's based basically on his own memories of life back home with the darkies, right? I know you can trust me as a historian, not just because of all the statistics I've assembled, but because I come from there and I know these people. And of course, Black historians were not allowed to do that. They had to dwell entirely in the realm of facts, statistics, things that you can find in documents. Oral history was off limits, it was mistrusted. But for generations, going back to John Blassingame or even before, we have people working in African American history, many of them who were African American, who are beginning to challenge that line. And so I think for at least 10, 15 years now, there have been Black historians who have been boldly putting elements of their own lives or their own families into this book. And so that gave me the courage to think that I could do it too. And I could do it vigorously and boldly and expressively. So this book, it comes partly out of family stories, and I can talk about that a bit if you want. But I think that it also comes out of a certain sense of place. That is, I grew up in Princeton. I consider myself a New Jerseyan. My mom used to call it this state, not the Garden State, but God's country. But I grew up in a community and in a family that had roots in the South, and those roots were not just notional. It wasn't just sort of a place that you imagined. It was a place that you went to. So, we would go visit relatives in Wappingers Falls, New York. We would also go visit relatives in Virginia. And we knew people who still had land in Virginia, and we would talk about it. And so, when my mom would talk about, God's country, she would also talk about the mother country, and that was Virginia. It was Cumberland County, Virginia. It was Mecklenburg County, Virginia, a little place called Baskerville Junction. We'd always talk about Baskerville Junction. We're like, did we own the place? No. The guy who owned us owned it. And so, I always had this image in my mind of, or just a sensibility, a sense of place that was in two places. So I grew up my whole life here. It's not like we moved around or anything. So I had a really strong sense of being rooted in this community. But this community, not just my family, but many of the families on Birch Avenue, Lee Avenue, John Street, many of the families in that neighborhood, they also have roots in the South and would think about places in the South and talk about places in the South. And so that sense of being sort of betwixt and between, or maybe not betwixt and between, but being in two places, I think, I didn't come from Virginia, but I think it became part of me. And so that was kind of one of the things that probably led me in the back of my mind, without even realizing it, to think about making a book that would be based partly in family stories, but also rooted in documents that came from places like Virginia.
Well, I have to say too, I remember though, there's another way I could ask this question, because you would sometimes come here during the years of research for this book, and I think Dirk was going to get into that, how much work went into this. You would pick up Penny, and she would go with you to the archive. A lot of us historians don't do that.
Sometimes to Africa, as I remember.
Right, and so you took it to that level as well, to involve family in the research for this book as well. Talk a little bit about what it meant to have family involved at that level.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I guess I could approach that question in two directions. One is that my mom and other family members opened doors for me to explore these aspects of history, not just family history, but beyond my family. So she would make connections. She reintroduced me to my Uncle Henry Smith, from whom I got a lot of the kind of backstory of some things that I found in the courthouse, right? So there's the things you find in the documents, and then there's the things that your uncle can tell you that's behind the documents. You put those together and you have a book, right? So she connected me on this one trip that we took, I think in 2007 maybe. And I hadn't seen Uncle Henry since we went back for Uncle Tom's funeral. I was like 5 years old. It was like 1. And so I hadn't seen him a long time. And he quickly demonstrated that he knew all the stories. He was that guy. He was that uncle who knew everything. He took me out. I remember my mom, we were looking in the woods or in some abandoned field for a place that our family used to have a little cabin in. And she was like, Dylan, leave your Uncle Henry alone. He's 75 years old. You can't have him jumping over. And as soon as she said that, I was about to turn around and say, Uncle Henry, it's okay. We don't have to look. He hopped over. He was very energetic. And so there was that sense of it, that she opened doors for me. He opened doors for me. But then this is the other way I could answer that question, which is that the research process brought me closer to them, and it brought me closer to her. It brought me close to her in a way that I hadn't known her before. We would have conversations in the car, At one point I said, you know, I'm gonna interview you. She's like, interview me? What are you talking about? Like, we're just talking. So we just talk. And those conversations just, you know, I think it sort of showed her something about me that she had always known of, but didn't really sort of experience firsthand. And I think the same thing went the other direction. And so that, I will always treasure those experiences, going with her to these research sites.
Well, I just have one more question before Dirk jumps in here. I have several more questions, and maybe there might be time for more of this. But Dylan, I know your work well. I've been reading your work and learning from it for a long time. And there seems to be something consistent with this book as well. This seems to be a book about people as people and not about race per se. And I'll explain what I mean by that. You say, I try to bring to light Black people's loves and angers and loneliness, their efforts to get ahead, or at least stay afloat, their mistakes and embarrassments, their fights, their ideas, their hopes, and disappointments, and all their messy humanness. That jumped out at me because that's Dylan Pendergraft, always trying to do that, where you're not de-emphasizing the importance of race, but you are emphasizing the importance of humanity. I mean, have I got that right?
Yes, yes, you got it.
Okay. Yeah, talk a little bit about that. I think we'd love to hear you talk about that messy humanness.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So, I'm going to answer it by kind of sketching what I think may be the story of African American history that most of us know well. So that story of African American history, the way that we commonly think about Black history is, for lack of a better term, a freedom struggle. It's a story of how a people who were oppressed for so long fought to go from second-class citizenship to first-class citizenship, from having no rights at all to having rights. And I guess the basic argument of my book is that that's true, but it also puts certain limits on what we can imagine Black people's lives to have been. And I really wanted to think about Black people, not as freedom strugglers only, but as real people, sometimes regular people, sometimes petty people, people who loved and fought and argued and disagreed and loved again. And the way that I figured out how to do that was by focusing not just on Black people's relationship with white people, but on Black people's relationship with each other. If I were to describe it in one way, it would be that the traditional story of African American history, it's fundamentally, I think, centered on race relations. And that is a necessary story. We have to have that story. But at some level, it's incomplete because it kind of implies that you can only talk about Black people when there's a white person somewhere in the picture. And that's just not true. Race is around us, right? It's always there. It's always influencing something somewhere. But there has got to be space, I think, for us to think about this world where that's kind of there in the background, not irrelevant, but it's there acting. But what is center stage is all this other stuff. So I chose to focus on Black people's relationships with each other. So I'll just give you a quick example of the kind of thing that enabled for me. It enabled me to, and there are many different things that we can talk about, but it enabled me to think about elder care. So we've probably all grown up thinking about the Black family in slavery and freedom, the Moynihan Report, like the broken Black family, the resilient Black family, which is a challenge to the Moynihan Report of 1965, where you have a generation of scholars and activists who say, no, these government officials are wrong. A mother-headed household is not actually dysfunctional. It's not going to lead to more crime. These are things that are common sense, right? It's not all of those things. But in pushing back against that image of the dysfunctional Black family, I think that those scholars and activists sometimes set up an image of Black family life that you couldn't see inside. It was set up in resistance to this other, resistance to white oppression. And one of the things that you can't see is a very simple question, something that Dirk has explored in his own work. What do you do when you are contemplating old age and you need to figure out who's going to take care of you in your old age? And what I discovered is something very similar to what Dirk explored in one of his books, is that people used their civil rights of property and their civil rights of contract in some ways to make agreements with their younger relatives. You know, someday all this will be yours. That's the title of Dirk's article, right? If you take care of me until I die, then you will get this house. You will get this piece of land, and that's the promise. And of course, what that means is that it's sort of tailor-made for conflict, because people are people, and people change, and people argue, and so sometimes those arguments wind up in court. And it's those court records that allow me to see people actually talking about what it means to be a Black person, growing old, contemplating old age, thinking about what a family member owes to another family member. You want to think about what is a Black family? Well, you have to think about questions like, who is a cousin? What does a child owe his parent? What does a parent owe his child? And those sorts of things come through clearly if you can think about questions that get into things like elder care.
Well, that's a wonderful segue then to Professor Hartnell.
Oh, I don't. Well, I thought, I mean, mostly I just want to hear Dylan. But I thought I would just maybe explain to the rest of you why this is such a prize-winning book to historians. So maybe just sort of indicate some of the ways it is a kind of challenge to a kind of convention. Dylan's already started to explain the challenge it poses to call it the mainstream of African American history, as well as the mainstream of American legal history. And I thought I would just detail that just a little bit for everybody. So it begins for me on the way to getting Chinese food last night. And I listened to an NPR show, maybe others of you were listening to the same show, about the 14th Amendment and its significance for American freedom and for the lives of African Americans across the past 150 years. One version of the significance of Dylan's book is that while one will learn much from Before the Movement that one needs to know about the contexts that have and have not made the 14th Amendment work, Dylan's book is not at all about the 14th Amendment. It's probably in the footnotes, but it's not really a book about the 14th Amendment. And yet it's all about freedom and civil rights and American constitutionalism, as well as about property law and family law and churches and various forms of notice and much, much more, which makes it a book about America. So here's 3 propositions about the book. First, Dylan uses the way Black people used private law, the law of property, contract, and associations, as a lens to tell a history of African American life in the ways that Dylan's already talked about. That's challenging because that lens turns out to cover so very much, more than any other single work I know of across 2 centuries of American history. It's challenging because underneath the book is a fundamental critique of the notion common to most histories and school texts as well as NPR, that what has defined African American life is nothing but repression and racism and struggles against white power. There's lots of repression and racism and struggles against white power throughout the book. Let me emphasize that. It's all there. But that is for Dylan never the whole of American Black freedom, which also included the ability to construct lives as individuals and family members and community members, often in litigation and struggle against other African Americans. So that's the first proposition. Second proposition, this is a book that opens up and this is a proposition that's more about me as a legal historian, which may not be what the rest of you care about, but I do care about American legal history. This is a book that opens up the whole of American legal history through the lens of the stories of how African Americans used the law. This is now the book I would start with if I wanted to introduce a reader to American legal history, full stop. Racism and terror and violence are always there, but they're never all that is there, just as they were never absent in other versions of American legal history. The book challenges thoroughly and devastatingly the common assumption that African American legal history is a separate subject from a predominant and predominantly white legal history. This is a book that is all by itself, and I like this phrase, a radical act of integration. Third, along the way, while explaining any number of technical legal subfields and doctrinal legal moves, Dillman tells really, really cool stories. I mean, just let me encourage the reading of it because it is so full of really interesting stories. Many of the stories are about cases and legal lives. Some of the stories, as we have learned, are about his life and his family's lives. Within a very few pages, while describing how one tenant held at bay a white mob and the white man who thought he could dispossess the tenant, we also learn about Dillon's love of the show The Electric Company, beloved also in my family, and also about the property deeds of the house he now lives in, which once were freighted with a racial restrictive covenant. This is a book that is both thick and full and also beautifully written, and written with an extraordinarily accessible voice. Now, what questions should I ask? I'm going to leave that for the moment, but let me just ask one last question, which again is a question that I wouldn't ordinarily ask before a general audience, but you really should know how much research this project took, how amazing the research project is. So, Dillon, would you tell us a bit about how you came to contemplate the exhausting project, and it is exhausting, that lies behind this trim and accessible book? Most of the time, those of us who do this kind of work learn to hide the sweat that underlay the work, because the general audience is supposedly not interested in that. Or so we think. But somebody needs to let people know that writing this book is all by itself an amazing achievement. And the story of how he put the project together is worth retelling. So I'm going to stop.
Should I say a little bit about the sources and the research? I use a lot of different kinds of sources. I've already talked about one of them. I was going to say interviews, but I guess they're not. But one of the main sources, or the one that took the most time, and I think this is what Dirk had in mind with that question, is records of local county courts. So, Mercer County Courthouse is down there. I went to 24 courthouses in 5 states in the District of Columbia. And what I did is I wanted to find cases involving Black people. And I started small. First I started with DC. And quickly, it became clear to me as I was sort of leafing through the docket book. So you have to imagine what a docket book looks like. It's a bound volume about this tall and this wide, and it's about this thick. So it's about 600-800 pages thick. It's cloth bound or leather bound. And if you go to the courthouse, they're lined up on shelves. And each one weighs.
This is where you get your hands dirty in the archives because your hands get really dirty.
They get dirty. So you go to the shelf, I went to the shelf and I got these docket books and I started looking. And pretty soon a problem appeared, which is this: the dockets don't say who's Black. I have this project I want to do on African American history, Black people in local courts, and here are the local court records, and I can't tell who's Black. And so, this is a problem. It's also a conceptual issue that leads to really interesting observations about race in law, which I can talk about later. I think they're really interesting. We can talk about the Roberts Court and how they talk about colorblindness all the time. There's a story behind that goes back 150 years. But the practical problem is the one in front of me. And the way that I got around it is I figured out that I could look up folks on the census. So at the time I started, the census wasn't digitized yet. So I would go and I would look it up on microfilm. But after a while, they started digitizing it. The Mormons have the census all searchable. So you can either, check your DNA, do the swab, but you can also find individual people in the census going back to 1790, all the way up to now it's 1950. And so I worked out sort of a plan. It sort of developed slowly over time, which is this. I went to the courthouses and I would go talk to the county clerk. Usually they would let me in the back and I would pull down these volumes and I would take photographs or I would copy down by hand the plaintiff and defendant in cases that I sampled every X case. And I tried to keep it even so that we didn't skew toward one month or another. And then I took that photographs of database back home and me and my research assistants looked up each one of the litigants, plaintiff and defendant, in the census. And about half the time, we could identify them with some degree of confidence. That's how we figured out who was black. So by the end, we looked up 14,000 cases. And out of those cases, we found 1,500 who were African American. Now these cases came from Illinois, Mississippi, Virginia, Washington, DC, and New Jersey, as well as some from North Carolina. So 1,500 out of 14,000 spread over the period 1872 to 1962. So it's this really long period of time, from the period just after African Americans are first allowed to enter and claim rights in a courthouse through sort of the early days of the modern civil rights movement. And what I found is that African Americans were not strangers to the courthouse. They were there all the time. And in fact, they were there in increasing numbers as Jim Crow set in, right? So like, you think about like a curve, right? The number of lynchings going up like this, well, the number of black people, the percentage of black people as a percentage of the cases in the local courthouse, also going like this. They're underrepresented. Like it's not like they're going in proportion to their share of the population. I also know that there's a lot of racism at the courthouse because they're usually going to court against other black people. They're not suing white people most of the time. So we know there's a lot of grievances that black people have against white people that they just have to eat it. They're getting cheated. There's nothing they can do about it. Sometimes they do, and those cases are spectacular, and I talk about those as well. But the vast majority of cases are cases where African Americans are working something out, either friendly or adversarially, with another black person. So once I had those numbers, right, that we're not done yet, then I would go back to the courthouse and I would find the case file. And it would be, a sheaf of papers, usually folded twice, so it's like literally bound with red tape. It's like red ribbon with wax on it. Right? The ribbon, you open it up, you flatten it out, and then you read it. It's all handwritten. And then you just read it. And I started to realize each one of those files tells a story. We were talking about stories earlier, and I should say that these two are storytellers par excellence. I learned a lot from these two. But in addition, I think probably all of us, to the extent that we're good storytellers, often we are inspired by, or we're using stories that we see in the documents, see in the archives. And of course, as we read those stories, we know that, especially when it comes to court records, that they're not true in any straightforward sense. They're trying to win, so they're telling a story that they think will help them win. But they are dramatic, and sometimes they're heartfelt. And I have to say, like, more than once, I found myself in tears in the courthouse as I read the things that people were saying about older relatives. Like this, so that you have certain kinds of cases where a black person is trying to claim property from another black person who says, you are not actually part of the family. Right? You say that you are a grandson or a niece, but you are not actually part of this family. how does a black person prove that you're a member of the family, say, in 1872? You tell stories. You tell stories about people you knew back during slavery. And some of those stories are just heartbreaking. They would tell stories about, you know, I know that this person is his father. Witness saying, I know that this person is his father because I saw his father led away in the slave coffle around the time that so-and-so was president. And then they, you know, the questioner, the lawyer would say, well, you know, would follow up question. And then the answer would come, of course we cried. We all cried when he was led away. And I'm sitting there and I'm just thinking to myself, it is a legal argument, it's an argument, it's a story that's being told to win a case, but it is also a profoundly human story. And it moved me.
Should we open things up to questions or
Could, yeah.
Or do you want?
Or we could talk about civil rights.
Yeah. If you want to also.
Are we opening up for questions or something?
Yeah, let's go for questions, and I can work in the story about civil rights
Yeah.
anytime. I'll give people a chance to settle in, and I'll just sort
Because
of
that's the
talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, that is the
Because the intervention
intervention.
you are making, we would be remiss still if we didn't ask you about that. You're not setting out to rewrite civil rights history necessarily, but reading this book, those of us who read civil rights history, we can't read civil rights history the same way anymore because of this book, right? So that critical intervention, I think, is important to talk. You alluded to it a little bit, but there will be those who will read this book and say, "Wow, this changes everything in terms of how we begin to think about the civil rights movement, the civil rights history." You do things with the dates, and you actually sort of build different kind of content in terms of what we should be thinking about.
You make it even more mysterious
Then it already is. But also clarifying.
Totally clarifying, but it becomes a huge, huge subject.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you've got to touch on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a little technical legal problem anymore.
I guess, okay, so here's a question that sort of occurred to me halfway through the writing process. The standard story that I was taught about the civil rights movement was that before the marchers, before Thurgood Marshall went to the South to represent black litigants in, you know, being accused of murder or school desegregation, before the 1930s, 40s, 50s, black people were essentially alienated from law. Like law, the courthouse and law more generally is a place you don't want to mess with if you're a black person in Mississippi. And so, you know, I'm going into these courthouses and I'm finding black people who are there. And I'm sort of thinking, well, what's that about? They're clearly not afraid to approach the courthouse. And I kind of knew from my own family that they're not afraid to approach the courthouse because that's where you pay your property taxes. You have to appear in person and pay them at the Cumberland County Courthouse. You know, so my Uncle Henry's telling me about how, you know, his father, George Smith, and then his uncle, Thomas Holcomb, they would take the tobacco down each year. They would sell it at the warehouse. They would pay their land tax at the courthouse. And I sort of got this impression of a place where black people could be and actually were exercising some kind of rights. I also knew from reading books that just a block away from that courthouse, they lynched a teenager, you know, during the childhood of my great uncle's father. And so both these things are happening at the same time. The incredible racial violence right next, you know, block away from the courthouse where they're exercising their civil rights. And so I'm sort of thinking about what's going on. So I turned back to a very famous book by Eric Foner, written in 1970, where he kind of reminded American historians that before, say, the 1930s, let's say, Americans, if they thought about rights at all, they typically thought of three kinds of rights. One was political rights, so that's the right to vote, the right to hold office, maybe the right to serve on a jury. The second is civil rights, and those get captured in the very first Civil Rights Act that our country ever passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which talks about property, contract, and the right to sue and be sued. So those three rights fall under the heading of civil rights for people before 1930 or so, if they talked about it. And then the third category is social rights. And social rights are kind of anything that white people don't want black people to have. Like going to school with white children, marrying white people, anything that white politicians want to scare voters about, they would pull up this idea of social equality. Like the Negro wants social equality. And Abraham Lincoln gets elected essentially by running on a platform that runs like this. I'm not in favor of black people having political rights. I don't want black people to vote. I'm not in favor of them having social equality, social rights. I'm not in favor of marrying black women, right? But I am in favor of them having civil rights. A black person who earns bread by the sweat of his brow is entitled to eat the bread that his own sweat produces. That's his winning formula. That's what carries him to the White House. And so I think that, in a way, it helps explain why African Americans are able to go to the courthouse and do these limited set of things. They're not going to the courthouse to vote. That is off limits. They're not going to the courthouse to marry someone of a different race. That's also off limits. That's the kind of thing that can get you lynched, either one of those things. But what is emphatically not off limits is exercising rights of property, rights of contract, and the right to sue and be sued. Why? Well, it's not just because of that 1866 act. It's because once slavery is over, once you can't whip black people into the fields and take the sweat of their brow, white people in the South actually need black people to have civil rights. Like what is sharecropping? Sharecropping is a contract. It's a highly exploitative contract where one person pays essentially a wage at the end of the year to the cropper, and the cropper in return makes a bargain to in one case involving my family, a case of Rosa Baskerville, I think that's probably related to my family that I found in the Virginia Historical Society. She literally agrees, according to this contract written in 1866, she and 40 other people, they're labeled on the contract as the Negroes formerly my slaves, and then William R. Baskerville, this white man, says, I agree to pay them 1/4 of the corn, 1/4 of the hay at the end of the year. And in return, these 40-some black people, they agree to work as they have done heretofore as slaves. So here is a contract. It's the emblem of freedom. This is what the world of freedom is built on. It's the world that we still live in today, right? Where one of the parties is literally agreeing to work like a slave, but she's free. She has a contract. So that's the world that I'm talking in. Now, not all contracts are as exploitative as that one, but I guess the takeaway point that I would make about civil rights is that black people are redefining rights, not in opposition to law, but through law. And white people are exploiting black people as best they can, not through lawlessness. It's not just the lynching, it's not the night riders. That matters a lot, right? But that's not primarily how white people come out on top again and again. They're doing it through the law, a law that is fundamentally tilted against black people, but does not exclude them. That's kind of the basic sort of story of civil rights that I'm telling. And then over time, we end up with a modern vision of civil rights, which is not about that at all. It's about the right not to be discriminated against. And that's the vision of civil rights that I think we're most familiar with. It's this 1964 Civil Rights Act and all the state and other federal laws that protect us from discrimination on the basis of race, sex, veteran status, disability, all those things. That concept of civil rights as anti-discrimination, anti-subordination, I think is the world that we live in. But Black people are making this world out of the former story of civil rights. So I'll just say one last thing and then shut up. That forgotten world makes possible the vision of civil rights that we have today. So if you want to ask yourself, like, if Black people were so excluded from law all those years, then why in the world would they put their faith in law when Thurgood Marshall came to see them? And I think part of the answer has to be that they were used to working within law, making the best that they could do through law, not against law, not outside of law, but through law. I think that's kind of what I mean when I say the hidden history of civil rights.
So maybe some questions. We have a few more minutes for some questions. Yeah.
Anyone has a question?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Dylan, how are you? Dylan is a personal friend of all his life since he was a little kid. The question I have, now we live in a time with revisionary history. You see things, especially in Florida, states in Florida and other places where they're turning history around to make it a feel-good kind of thing. How do we get what you're saying today, which I think is extremely important, in our school systems for our young folks? Because I think that's where this has to start. Thank you.
I think it starts with politics, and when I say politics, I mean the school board, the state legislature, the schoolhouse. You know, like that story of civil rights that I'm telling, it matters, but it's incomplete without the story of politics, formal politics, where we can actually go and vote out one school board and put in another one. But that's hard work. You know, that's community organizing. But it is the stuff of freedom. That's what changed the laws in Mississippi. It wasn't just people, the March on Washington. It continued after the March on Washington, and I think it still continues today. I mean, I think you can sort of see what's happening in Florida as nothing new. I can put it a different way too. In 1935, W.B. Du Bois wrote a book called Black Reconstruction in America. And at the end of that book, the last chapter of the book, he talks about the history that's being taught to children in schools. And these histories are being written by, they're being published by the major publishing houses. And versions of this history are being taught to graduate students at places like Columbia and Johns Hopkins. And it is just racist as the day is long. Happy slaves on the plantation. It's kind of like Ron DeSantis on steroids. Right?
Yeah.
And Du Bois says, I stand aghast at what my profession has done to African American history. I stand aghast. And now I think the historical profession is obviously in a very different place. We don't write like that anymore. But that doesn't mean that our ideas translate very easily into what gets taught in the Florida schools or the Texas schools. That is something that only the people themselves can do. We try to write what we know, and we try to uncover the truths as best we can see them, but then it takes a community organizing to bring about change.
Just raise your hand. It's very nice. How long did it take you, the research? work here. Give it a adjournment, France.
It took a while.
Have you always focused on legal history, and how did you get involved? Because you don't have a law degree, I don't, do you? And how did that affect your research and what you were doing? And did you have to consult with, obviously, with a lot of lawyers, et cetera? But if you could comment on that.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. I don't have a law degree, so kind of how did I get involved? How did I get interested in legal history? So my first book was about how enslaved people owned property and while they were slaves. And I ended up writing it using a source that, after I published the book, it turns out it was basically a legal source. It was the records of a government commission that was trying to compensate loyal Southerners for property that they lost during the Civil War to Union troops. So I published this book, and I had people sort of talking with me and saying things like, this is kind of a legal history if you have you ever thought about that? One of those people was Dirk. and I kind of listened to that, and I felt like, legal, I guess, I don't know. And I think, it sort of dawned on me that indeed there was a story that was partly about African Americans. Me using legal sources to tell a story about African Americans. But then there's a story that's about law. It's about civil rights. It's about changes in the way that people think about civil rights. It's about legal institutions, lawyers. I've got tons about lawyers who are representing these clients. Like, why are they doing this? They're white lawyers. Some of them white supremacists. Why are they doing this? And it was, I think, almost entirely due to people like Dirk kind of encouraging me, generously saying, like, you might have something interesting to say in this field. And so that's kind of how I became involved with it.
Yes, thank you. You made the point that blacks were able to use the court system with regard to property, inheritance, et cetera, with those areas. Suppose black and white goals within those court cases were in opposition. Were they still able to use the court system to get to define their rights, to get what they deserved within a legal system?
So is it? I could reframe that and say, could a black person sue a white person? Is that kind of one way to frame it?
Or yes.
They could.
And did it work?
And did it work?
Yeah.
So I have to sort of couch it and say, I can't see all the cases that they didn't bring. I can't see all the grievances that they didn't bring. Whenever I see a case of a black person suing a white person, I have to assume that there are a lot of others where they just had to swallow whatever was being dished out. But there are a number of cases where black people sued white people. Sometimes they sued over a significant amount of money. And one of the things I find fascinating is that they get white lawyers. Those are, white lawyers drive black lawyers out of the legal profession in the 1890s in the South. Why? It's partly because they want the business that black clients are bringing in. Black people pursuing claims of property and contract and tort, they are valuable clients for white lawyers, and that's one reason why the legal profession turns white after the 1890s. And so you can find in the archives some of the most notorious white supremacists that you can imagine, like James Eastland, the master of the Senate, the guy who filibustered the Civil Rights Act in 1964 for what, I guess, many, many hours. Like, he bottled it up in committee. Strom Thurmond then filibustered it. But like, James Eastland had clients in Mississippi, and he represented them against white-owned individuals and corporations, and he did it because he got a cut. He got a piece of the action, and you can see that again and again. That was one of the most valuable things that I found during the research. We talked about the court records, but lawyers' papers turned out to be incredibly valuable. I had access eventually to the papers of a few white lawyers like James Eastland, and including a few black lawyers in Philadelphia and Baltimore, And their files are absolutely incredible, and somebody should go and write books based on those.
Not you?
I'm tired. I need a nap.
Rest after all of that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Dylan, I don't have a question really. I just have a lot of praise. We all knew that you would go on to do great things when you were in high school, you know. So, shockingly enough, I'm a history teacher, and I would like to say that in terms of like to answer the question of the gentleman in the back, we are trying to reframe the narrative in our history classes to the next generation. I was inspired listening to what you were saying, and I was just thinking about Elizabeth Freeman, right, in Sheffield, Massachusetts, right after, you know, Massachusetts passed their constitution. And so what we're talking about here is like literally from the very beginning, black women taking agency, seeking out their actual rights under the law, partnering with a white lawyer, and then changing the narrative entirely, right? So we go back to 1787 with that. So not really a question, but like it's always been there. And I'm really so happy that you're able to like do this work right here. And I'm also just so proud to say that, you know, I got to, you know, be in the same class in high school, play on the same soccer team, you know, so those sorts of things. Thank you.
I told you I'd be emotional. You know, what you say kind of brings me back to one thing that I missed when I was answering Nancy's question. I talked about organizing on the ground for change, but none of that means anything. We can change the curriculum, we can change the textbook, but none of it means anything without the teachers who will put it into action in the classroom thoughtfully, sensitively. Some of this is tough stuff, but with brilliance. And so, hats off to you for bringing it home. Thank you for that question.
Yep.
Aside from the law, obviously you got involved in a lot of genealogy, I guess going back and looking at some family history. How did that affect you, and how important do you think that is, you know, to all communities, and having that connection with their past?
I think I found it to be incredibly important personally. I talked a little bit before about how this process brought me closer to even my own mother, my closest family member. But the other thing that I became intensely aware of during the writing of this project is the incredible vibrancy of the genealogical community. There are many more genealogists than there are historians, and they are doing work every day, making these connections, and also incredibly generous. And you might think that I thought maybe that genealogy was just about looking up your own ancestors and then you're done, but it's not that at all. It's like this whole community who generously are helping one another to make connections. And so I feel like, you know, I'm standing on the shoulders of many different people, but the genealogy community is one of those to whom I owe so much. So it has been incredibly important to me along the way.
Please join me in thanking Dylan Fenimore.
Please buy the book.